Good morning, everybody. My name is Zinat Rahman. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute of Politics at the University of Chicago. Thrilled to be joining you here today. Thanks for being here, and thanks for the Chicago Council for hosting this conversation. I'm going to offer a really brief introduction of our panelists. If you want their full bios, they are well televised on our website. On the website, we have all the way to my left, Ivo Daalder, who's the CEO of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. He's the host of World Review with Ivo Daalder, and he previously served as U.S. Ambassador to NATO from 2009 to 2013. And Ian Bremmer, who is the president and founder of Eurasia Group and G0 Media, which provides engaging coverage of international affairs. He's an author of 11 books, a foreign affairs columnist, and an editor-at-large for Time magazine. So you can find Ian if you want to hear more online. Kevin Rudd became Australia's ambassador to the United States in March 2023. Previously, he was served as Prime Minister of Australia from 2007 to 2010, and then as Minister for Foreign Affairs before a second term as Prime Minister in 2013. Kevin is one of the foremost experts on China, and we'll be hearing his takes on all of that today. We'll start off the program with a brief discussion for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have some time for Q&A from our audience. And would like to remind everybody that today's program is on the record, and any views expressed by the speakers at the council are their own and do not reflect any institutional positions. So with that, we're here to kind of talk about the threats of the global world order and how we avoid World War III, and what are the geographical and technological forces that are currently shaping our world, U.S. relationship with our allies, et cetera. So last week, President Biden attended the 80th anniversary of the D-Day invasion in Normandy, where Allied troops turned the tide of World War II. In the period since World War II, there have been a number of other major conflicts, both involving the U.S. and ones that U.S. hasn't been a participant to, but no other global conflagrations. So can you set the table? I wonder if we can start with saying, concurrently, we have experienced the greatest period of economic and technological growth that the world has ever seen. Why hasn't there been another world war since World War II? Like, what are the conditions that we're talking about here that are, and the threats and the risks assessments that we're going into? Who wants to take that kind of bigger global picture before we dive in a little? Ivo, this is your house. You start.
This is in my house. All right. I think fundamentally, it is because the United States has played the stabilizing role in the world order. What is different from World Wars I and II and no wars after World War II is that the United States played an active role in world affairs. It was dragged into World War I in 1917. It then decided foolishly to stay out of world affairs after the end of the war. In fact, so foolishly that the Chicago Council on Foreign Relations, as it was then called, was created in 1921 with the 1922 with the explicit mandate to help people understand why a globally engaged America was important for stability and security and prosperity here at home, a mission that we've now been executing for over 100 years. But it was the absence of the United States in the 1920s and 30s, a turning away from working with other countries, allies, alliances, a insistence on creating tariffs and closed economic systems, and not having a more open economic system, a tolerance for regimes that were actively suppressing and expanding the democratic nature of their neighbors and their own countries, that led to World War II. And in many ways, you need to look at, as E.H. Carr, that great historian, look at this as the 30-year crisis. It was a crisis from the mid 1910s to the mid 1940s, and it was America's decision in 1941. In fact, it was the Japanese decision to attack the United States that enabled the United States to become the global power that it has been ever since. And the idea that the United States learned from that 30-year crisis And then I think much of the rest of the world learned was that an actively engaged in the United States that works together through security alliances, that open up economic systems and to defense freedom and democracy around the world is important, not just for the rest of the world, but for the United States, that we are secure when others are secure, that we are prosperous when others are prosperous, that we are free when others are free. And that fundamental understanding, which has driven American foreign policy, Democratic and Republican alike, is at the core for why we haven't had a war. And it's that understanding that currently is being debated actively in the United States and may have a different outcome. And it is being challenged actively by the forces that we're here to talk about, China, Russia, and technology in important ways. And that's, 80 years is a pretty good run for no global war. When you think about it, in history, it's a very good run. It doesn't make for an optimistic future to say it's been a good run, to say how long is that run going to last? And I think that's part of the debate that we're having today.
Yeah. Ian, Kevin, would you add anything to that?
Well, I mean, what I would add, I agree with everything Ivo just said. I would add, so why is that now coming to an end?
Yeah.
Not because I predict World War III, I don't, but I certainly think the likelihood of a global conflagration is a lot higher than it's been over the past 80 years. And I think there are three structural reasons for it. One is that when the Soviet Union collapsed, the Russians were not integrated into the institutions of the West, not NATO, not the EU. I don't care who you blame for that, but that's the reality. Russia today is in decline economically. They're in decline geopolitically. And they know it, and they blame the United States. They blame the West, and their principal allies are North Korea and Iran. Those are rogue states. Those are chaos actors. Those are countries that benefit from bringing down the existing global system. That's a real problem. Second reason is that China was brought into a U.S.-led global system, certainly economically, to a degree politically as well, but on the presumption that as China became wealthier, that they would become American. They're not. They are still state capitalists, they're still authoritarian, and the West, particularly the U.S., is fundamentally uncomfortable with that reality. And that is creating an awful lot of conflict at the high level and undermining the ability to have peace and stability in an integrated global system. Third is that while those first two things were happening, lots and lots of people around the developed world, the advanced industrial democracies, but particularly here in the United States, increasingly felt that their own political leaders and institutions were illegitimate, and therefore that they should not support the idea of providing global security, of promoting global trade, of promoting democracy. And indeed, when you look at the opposition in the United States, increasingly fashionable among political leaders, tearing down organizations like the United Nations, which were created by the United States and reflected the values that America stood for, I think it is in part because many of these people are deeply embarrassed and ashamed that the United States no longer does reflect those values. And so the existence of those organizations and their comparative legitimacy is an embarrassment, is a shame for the United States. But I think if you put those three reasons together structurally, and you'll note in the audience, I did not mention Biden, I did not mention Trump, I have not talked about Xi Jinping. These are structural, they're much bigger than an electoral cycle, and they won't get fixed in an electoral cycle. But I do think that those are the fundamental changes from the period that Ivo was talking about, which is a very good run, to one that is now, at the very least, far more uncertain.
So we'll come back to kind of the structural, I think, institutional, and just risk perception from individuals, particularly like younger generations, and how they perceive these institutions and their own democracies. But I would like to let's hit on geopolitical conflicts and Russia and China. And Kevin, I'd like to get you in the conversation. Can you?
I've never been this quiet for so long.
Can you speak to what are the key components of China's global strategy? You spend a lot of time thinking about the mind of Xi Jinping. And so what do U.S. policymakers need to understand about China to effectuate our own U.S. policy on vis-a-vis China?
I think we stand back for it all. Eva's introductory point frames where we are, which is that in geopolitics, nature abhors a vacuum. And what we had prior to 1939 was a vacuum. And that's in large part, not exclusive part, why we ended up with World War II, which then fundamentally rewrote the reality and the institutions of the global system. After World War II, what are the two realities coming out of that which China is now challenging? The United States, having made a mistake in 1919, corrected in 1945, and a great tribute to the Truman administration, they looked at this. The guy who owned the drapery store in Missouri decided that, a very smart guy, and with his smart advisors, decided we had to do better. And so two things he built. One was an international security order, which was anchored in American strategic power, both in Asia and in Europe. And then, based on that underpinning geopolitical stabilization, he then constructed, or he and his team constructed, rules-based international system anchored in the United Nations, the World Trade Organization, then the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank. By and large, with notable exceptions, that held. We nearly had a come to Jesus, come to Marx moment in the Cuban Missile Crisis, but we managed to survive that. Soviet Union fell. China, as Ian said before, adhered by and large to the system which the United States had already created under Deng Xiaoping, not under Mao, but under Deng Xiaoping. And that held through until about 2012, 2017, which brings us to the present. And this is the difference between structural factors and what those of us who engage in some of the literature on this call agency factors, that's individual political leaders. Xi Jinping has made a huge difference, and that is he's reached two sets of conclusions. One is he regards the fundamental geopolitical, geostrategic stabilization role of the United States as unacceptable. If you look carefully at the text of all Chinese strategic policy statements, they describe the US alliance structure as outmoded Cold War tactics and no longer with a role to play in 21st century security policy reality. And then secondly, what Xi Jinping has sought to do is incrementally to start challenging the rest of the international rules-based system. And he has done so both in the UN and a whole range of other international institutions, and creating a parallel set of institutions as well, which I think comes to the question, why is he doing that? And I'll shut up at this point, is he's doing it because he believes that China now has sufficient national wealth and power, the dream of Chinese reformers for more than 125 years, and now has sufficient national wealth and power to assert itself as a central factor in global geopolitics and global geoeconomics, together with an alternative set of interests and values underpinning that, which are quite distinct and quite different from those which we have shared with the United States since 1945.
What are those alternatives?
Well, on the security order, it is as I described, which is rather than an alliance-based structure anchored in the superpower of the United States, what he describes as common security. If you parse that further, what it means is a set of security relationships, which has China much more at the center of those arrangements, though it is still an imprecise agenda in the way in which it's being articulated. In terms of values, what you see already is China taking the United States and the democratic world to task in the United Nations and the Human Rights Council on the definition of human rights. It is saying that the Universal Declaration of 1948, drafted in part by Eleanor Roosevelt, which has underpinned the moral and frankly normative order of the international system since then, needs to be supplanted by nation-specific, culture-specific rights and responsibilities, which are much more akin to the centrality of the sovereignty of the state. And that's a common view that he has now with Vladimir Putin, bringing in our Russian friends, and that's why when they signed their strategic partnership without limit on the eve of the Ukraine invasion in 2022, one of the clauses, interestingly buried in the text of that, is a commitment to revisit the Universal Declaration. So both on the high politics and strategy of geostrategic power. China does not regard the US system as valid and alliances as valid, and now seeks to break them where they can. And I'm not making this up, it's what China declares in its formal positions. And secondly, on the normative structure underneath it, also seeking to revisit that, given the amount of diplomatic energy they put into with their support in the global south, to deconstruct that normative structure anchored in the 48 Universal Declaration.
So let's talk about Xi's friend Putin and Russia, and Ivo. I mean, I'm asking you all to kind of prognosticate a little, but about where we are right now with Russia, Ukraine, and where you see that going, and how that is further eroding kind of the rules-based international order.
Well, I think what is evident, and if you didn't know it before February of 2022, you knew it in February 2022, is that Vladimir Putin is committed to overturning not only the post-war, but also, in particular, the post-Cold War European security order. A European security order that was based on the idea that what had worked for Western Europe during the Cold War, which was an American-based alliance system that allowed for a blanket of security to enable a completely destroyed subcontinent to emerge as a prosperous economic actor and, in fact, a prosperous civil power in the world, to expand that zone of peace further and further towards the East, bringing in Central and East European countries into that very structure of the European Union and NATO, and centralizing that. Ian is right that Russia's absence from that order, and we can then debate what and how, et cetera, but the absence of that order led Vladimir Putin to conclude that the problem was not Russia or its own particular neighborhood, but the reality that it was confronting an expansionary Western/US-led effort to undermine Russian security. And his strategy has been to disrupt that ever since, not only just by trying to figure out how to dominate his immediate neighborhood, as he did in Georgia in 2008 and in Ukraine since 2014. And we should look at the Ukraine war not as a war that started in 2022, but it was a war that started in 2014. 30,000 Ukrainians were killed from 2014 till the day of the invasion, the full-scale invasion on February 24th, 2022. And he has been trying to not only control his immediate neighborhood, but disrupt and undermine the cohesion of the West. And one of the things we're not paying enough attention to, and I think we in the West are not paying enough attention to, is that there's a very deliberate strategy now on the part of Russia to undermine Western cohesion through a series of what is known as hybrid kind of attacks on energy systems, attacks on weapons production and storage facilities in Europe, and possibly in the United States. We have had some very serious, mysterious bombings and fires emerging in strange kinds of places that, when we will look back, wouldn't be surprising if the Russians were behind it. The same is happening in the disinformation space, where we are spending more time thinking about it, the reality that the Russians and the Chinese, but the Russians in particular, are behind an effort to disrupt politics in the West, including in the United States. They've been doing it actively since 2016 and are continuing to do that, and are engaged in a variety of assassinations of not only people who are close to them, but are also opposed to Russia. So you have a whole-scale Russian strategy of disruption designed to undermine the cohesion of the West, in order for Russia then to extend its own influence in Europe. And it's trying to do that increasingly in alliance with Iran and North Korea, but also China and this relationship between Russia and China, which is a interesting relationship, very different than the Sino-Soviet Pact of the 50s, in which, in this case, China is the leader and Russia is the junior partner, is still seen by Putin as necessary for him to achieve his disruptive effect in the rest of Europe.
So one tool that that he has wielded and others are AI and AI kind of tech disinformation. We were talking about the European Parliament elections in the green room, and Ian, you said that AI didn't play a significant role in disrupting that. It seems India, Mexico, kind of some of the recent elections that we've had. Can you talk a little bit about AI and election integrity? But then I think also, I don't think we understand this very well in terms of policy. And so take both of those on.
Well, I'm going to take this question in a slightly different direction. I mean, it's first of all true that in the last 30 years, the nature of technology has really changed in terms of being something that facilitated democratic and open systems and undermined authoritarian regimes. The communications revolution, the internet, the World Wide Web, the ability of people around the world to have access and more transparency to the way things were happening that undermined governments. That happened with the colored revolutions. It happened to a lesser degree, but still the same structure with the Arab Spring. Today, we're talking about a top-down data revolution, a surveillance revolution, AI revolution that really doesn't empower individuals. It empowers the corporations, the governments that control these monopoly platforms. And that is an advantage to the platforms, and it's an advantage to the authoritarian regimes, and it undermines democracies. So that's a structural change, in addition to the three things that I mentioned before, that should make us feel like our system is less stable. Our system is less resilient to shock. But the other thing I wanted to mention, since you're asking about technology, Kevin mentioned agency, structural effects as opposed to individual effects. Yeah. I don't usually talk much about individual effects, but they matter here. Mm-hmm. Because when we talk about what worries me with our world today, and start with Ivo's comments on Russia, we've got a leader in Vladimir Putin, who's now over 70, who doesn't work as hard as he used to, isn't as interested in getting the right facts, has people around him that blow smoke up his ass constantly. And it is. And of course, I mean, the reason that we are in such a pickle right now, in part, is because he made an enormous misjudgment in having no clue of the kleptocracy and the incapacity of his military when he decided that he was going to go all in Ukraine in February of 2022. Now, this is a man who is running a country that not only occupies the largest geography of any country in the world in critical resources, but also happens to control, without a lot of checks and balances, the largest nuclear arsenal in the world. We are about to elect in the United States one of two people that are clearly far too old to be in that position, this audience notwithstanding, right? And one of whom is completely unfit for the job, in my view, which I'm public about. And I really, when we're talking about the most powerful country in the world, the agency of what that means it creates much greater danger, much less resilience in our system, in a system that structurally already is challenged for reasons that all of us on the panel have discussed. Then you get to the technology question. And the reality is that these new technologies in the West are not controlled by governments. In most cases, they're not even controlled by big multinational corporations that have been around for a long time. In many cases, they are controlled by a small group of men, right, who are arbitrary and capricious in the implications of their business models for democracy, for civil society, for human beings. That's certainly what we see happening with AI. Yeah. And we've seen a bunch of that around Altman and the reactions to him from inside his company. We certainly see it with Elon every day. We should worry about that. I mean, if our geopolitics, if our political system is not only getting weaker structurally, but is being affected by a small number of individuals with agency that we fundamentally mistrust, in how they will act with decisions in their power to affect our lives, clearly that means that we're heading in a direction that is more unsustainable.
So what needs to be, how do we push back? What needs to be done?
Well, there are a lot of things one can do. I suspect that we need to have at least a larger crisis than we presently have to force some of those decisions.
Right.
In other words,
crisis happen with whoever gets elected in November, if it's Donald Trump?
It could be. I mean, certainly January 6th was too small a crisis. And you saw that with a majority of Republicans in the House that very evening deciding not to certify the election. It was too small a crisis. The pandemic was too small a crisis to force either red or blue states or countries around the world to say, no, this is unacceptable. We have to put better governance in place. So whatever comes has to be larger than that.
What connection are you making between the pandemic and the AI kind of disinformation, the tech being at the hands of very few? What is that connection there?
Well, I mean, I worry about disinformation. Of course. I mean, I now, one of the things that comes out of the pandemic, Kevin was talking briefly upstairs before we started here about the role that the Chinese disinformation played in the early days. I look at the fact that the United States increasingly has politicized its own CDC. Right. Its own drug companies. People increasingly do and don't believe in the efficacy of science on the basis of their political orientation, which is an insane place to be, right? But it nonetheless describes the state of the world. When Elon Musk promotes on his owned media channel that Dr. Fauci is personally responsible for the deaths of over 1 million Americans, I do not think we should normalize that. We have never experienced a time when the wealthiest person and arguably the most powerful individual in the country has promoted that kind of directly weaponized disinformation aligned with the person that may be about to be the president of the United States. I think we should not fall asleep on that clear and present danger to our democracy, period.
Kevin?
Interesting. On the question of tech platforms, tech companies, and artificial intelligence in particular, it's often useful simply to reflect how the authoritarian states view this as well. Looked at through the lens of Xi Jinping's national interests and Communist Party interests, it's often assumed in the democratic world and in the Western world within that, that artificial intelligence and the enormous powers of the technology platforms represent an undiluted advantage for the authoritarians through the machinery of the surveillance state. And there's some truth in that. But if you look at the enormous regulatory crackdown within China against their own domestic tech platforms, it is clearly a reflection of the dangers which the Chinese Communist Party, holding on to absolute political power, see in their own domestic tech platforms. For example, go to the question of generative artificial intelligence. Can you imagine some guy in the back blocks of Chongqing posing a question which is, what is the best way to overthrow the Communist Party? And just see how that gets responded to. And of course, there's a fair bit of literature on that subject in the Chinese-speaking world. You don't have to simply look to the English-speaking world. Think of all the literature which exists in Hong Kong and other parts of the Chinese diaspora. So therefore, what we see is the most stringent regulatory crackdown on the tech companies and the new regulatory approach to artificial intelligence, which doesn't simply carry with it the assumption that this is a bonanza for the authoritarian state. They too recognize its huge challenges in terms of companies, which in their view, by the way, then end up being more powerful in the political process. Hence the crackdown against Jack Ma. Hence the crackdown domestically, frankly, against ByteDance. the owners of TikTok. Hence the refusal to allow anything like TikTok to function within China itself. It's a much milder version of that which is available domestically. I think it's instructive to look at how the CCP system is responding to this, rather than just it being seen as this huge advantageous development from the perspective of the authoritarians.
Let me add, just because I think Kevin's point is exactly on point, and it leads to this larger question. And Ian, you've thought more about this than anyone I know. It is actually that the tech companies are beating both the democratic system and the authoritarian system, and really are emerging as unregulated, self-guided monsters, my word, that are changing the nature of global power, in which it isn't just strong states or multinational corporations, we talked about in the 70s, but singular individuals running incredibly powerful tools that are completely disrupting the way in which societies are interacting, and as a result having geopolitical consequences that neither authoritarians nor democratic systems can control. That's the danger that we are really confronted with, that we see every day in the actually we don't see it. It's in the algorithms that are degenerating what you see and when you don't see, which is why TikTok's not allowed to be used in China. It's why in China they have now erased the internet. A fascinating article in the New York Times the other day that if you wanted to search in China for the earthquake that happened, what was it, 10, 12 years ago, that caused tens of thousands of deaths. You can't find anything in China on the internet about this because it has been erased. So that's a government working with technology in order to try to control what they fear themselves can control the CCP and indeed their own society. That is something that, frankly, we haven't thought about, that kind of danger. And it's very different than, Vladimir Putin. Yes, nuclear weapons are a big deal, not to underestimate, but it's a very dangerous, a different way of thinking, and it makes it more difficult for us to figure out how do you deal with that threat and what do you do in order to counter it.
I mean, at the most existential level, what we need are companies to be responsible for the negative externalities that are caused by their business models. We need more capitalism. We can't only have capitalism when companies make profits. We have to have capitalism when companies make losses. They don't get to capture the regulatory system and make the rules that say, no, those losses are on your kids. They're on society. But that is precisely what's happening right now. And that is the way that the American system is most singularly broken as a political system compared to the Europeans or compared to the Chinese, right? I mean, honestly, that is, I think, the biggest danger to our democracy.
Are our U.S. lawmakers equipped to address this? I mean, if you're talking about Congress, and I want to get to turn to the election after this, but what's your take on that?
Well, usually when I get questions that bring together U.S. lawmakers and equipped, right? I have a knee-jerk reaction. I'm sitting like this, and I feel like you're just hitting the knee, right? But no, they are increasingly aware of these problems, and certainly there has been more effort to, which we've seen in the executive order, but we've seen from people like Senator Warner or others, to try to recognize, identify what the challenges are, at least define them.
Right.
But do they have the power, and can they move fast enough in an environment where, this isn't like climate change, where we can get it wrong for 30 years, but we can eventually start putting money into new transition energy, and we will eventually get there.
Right.
No, this is like a matter of 3 to 5 years, where
That's kind of terrifying, thinking that our election is in November, a president is in term for 4 years. So if we have a Trump presidency, I mean, how is that a threat to, if at all, the rules-based international order with his kind of isolationist, unilateral worldview? And will he do anything about the threat of disinformation and AI.
Well, it's very interesting because the one thing that we've seen that plays on Trump and technology has been his view on TikTok, which has flipped completely from TikTok should be banned to I will never ban TikTok because Jeff Yass, the major investor in TikTok, gave him a couple $1 million. Right. So if only we could find some investors that would give him a bunch of money that would say, we want you to actually protect democracy, that might be the best way at it, right? But absent that, look, I more seriously, I am less worried about Trump's foreign policy in many ways, because I don't think he cares as much about foreign policy. And I also think that the people that he is likely to appoint to a cabinet are going to be similar in many ways because he so controls the GOP. I mean, if you tell me that Pompeo is back and, you tell me that Lighthizer is going to be treasurer, folks like that, I mean, those you may or may not agree or like them, but they're adults. Yeah. One can understand how they would formulate policy. But when it comes to rule of law in the United States, and when his top priority is enemies are going after me, and I've got to ensure that can never happen again, and I go after them, then I worry much more about the Department of Justice, the FBI, the IRS, like those things. That would be where I think democracy under a Trump administration would be most impacted.
When Ian and I were at the baseball yesterday, Red Sox versus White Sox.
Who won, by the way?
And the Red Sox. 10th inning. And I've, after 10 years living in your country, I finally understand some of the rules. You tell me the cricket is slow. But anyway, so we're out there and we're actually having this conversation, as you do.
Fun baseball talk, yeah.
Yeah, fun baseball talk between hot dogs. And it was, on your core question is, what can legislators and regulators do? The problem is, and not just the United States, but across the democratic world, is the exploding nature of the technology within artificial intelligence, within the algorithms, within generative AI, and then more broadly, the supporting platforms in terms of the speed of semiconductors and what they can do, is that the time it takes us to reach a regulatory conclusion within a democracy, usually you have a further explosion on the technological front, which actually renders your original proposed solution redundant, which means that your self-governing regulatory structure across the major corporations is the only thing which stands, frankly, in the road, between us and unacceptable levels of social and economic chaos. I think the second challenge is if the United States, for example, a little like the Europeans in terms of their digital governance laws, was to reach a national consensus, could you actually frame that as being a consensus-based regulatory approach across the democratic world? Possible, but difficult because of the exploding technology factor that I spoke of before. Not through the UN, that's not going to work, but plurilaterally across the democracies, possibly. Thirdly, is any such compact possible with the authoritarian world? I think not, which is why the United Nations negotiations on these questions have ground to a halt, in effect. But I think it is the dynamic nature of the tech, which, as Ian said, climate change is a slowly unfolding train wreck. This is a rapidly unfolding train wreck. So the question is, how quickly can we, as democracies,
Ivo, do you have a quick point, and then we should go to the slowly unfolding train wreck?
I mean, it's worse because the technology that is being built and the ability of that technology to self-generate outcomes that even those who are building the technology don't understand and don't know. This is the debate at OpenAI. This is the fundamental debate about safety.
Some don't care.
No, so about safety versus profit.
Some don't care.
And if what drives you is profit, and you don't care about the safety parameter, then what is happening is you don't care whether the system will self-destruct or destroy something else because you're making money in the process. And we are now driven, it seems to me, and this is a peculiar American phenomenon, driven by a number of people who have decided that they can make an incredible amount of money
Right.
without having to worry about the consequences of the technology that they create, which is unregulatable because they've let it go. And that's the world that we are. It's not that we're getting robots to change, to do stuff and we're going to be taken over by machines. I'm worried less about that. I worry more about the reality that this technology isn't being regulated, cannot be regulated because it's happening too quick, and the people who own it don't care.
I want to get off of AI because I only have, is that okay?
Sure, yeah.
And move on to the Middle East, which the conflict in Israel and Gaza. And you have, I think Blinken is in the region today trying to broker a ceasefire deal. And Ian, this is for you. How do you see this ending? I mean, to me, it seems like we as the United States want a resolution to this more than the Israelis or Hamas, certainly. And so in terms of pushing the ceasefire forward, 4 hostages were rescued this last week, a few days ago. Lots of lost Palestinian life in that process. You have this kind of global sentiment that's, pro-Palestinian. How does this play out? I mean, I don't see a path forward. I don't see where this path is going.
Well, I mean, it's not just that the United States wants an end to this conflict. Pretty much every country in the world wants an end to this conflict. The Chinese want an end to this conflict, right? I mean, the Europeans, the Gulf states, most everyone wants an end to the conflict, except for the Israelis and Hamas. And that's a very serious problem. And what's happened since October 7th is you have deeply radicalized the entirety of the Israeli and Palestinian populations. The Israeli population, because of the horror, far more magnified than anything the U.S. experienced in 9/11 on October 7th, that is still happening for them, with 100,000 Israeli Jews that have been evacuated from their homes and their schools still today, equivalent to 4 million Americans, right? Imagine if 8 months after 9/11, Connecticut or Louisiana were evacuated. It's all we'd be talking about, and the hostages. And for the Palestinians, of course, they believe that they are being ethnically cleansed. They believe that a genocide is being perpetrated against them by the Israelis, irrespective of whether we believe that. They believe that. So you've gotten much farther away from a two-state solution, in my view. And over the weekend, of course, not only did you have the rescue of those hostages and lots of Palestinians killed, far more because of the way Hamas is holding the hostages, but also far more because Israel is less concerned about knock-on civilian casualties than I think they should be. So both of those things are true at the same time. But also Benny Gantz just resigned from the war cabinet. And that means that you no longer have a unity war cabinet. You instead have Bibi Netanyahu being driven much more singularly by the far right. And if he wants to stay in power, we talked about Putin, we talked about Elon, now talk about Bibi. You've got a guy whose interests are not being driven nearly as much in alignment with the long-term sustainability of Israel as they should be.
Right.
That is the reality. And that's going to get you much worse outcomes than you would like. And that puts Biden in a horrible position, because he's in political no man's land, closer to this Israeli government than any leader in the world, and antagonizing most of his own Democratic base, particularly the young, as a consequence, but also trying to put some limits on what is being done in terms of eventual governance for the Palestinians, and the weaponry systems that are provided to the Israelis if they don't proceed with those limits, in ways that give Trump, sort of an open path to say, you're forcing our top ally after the worst violence since the Holocaust to try to fight with a hand behind their back. So, I mean, there's no win on this. And the fact that on July 24th, Netanyahu has been invited to address Congress, included by the Democratic leadership in the House and Senate, right? Because their constituents are more important to them than winning the election in November.
I work on a college campus. So you imagine this year, I mean, there is, in terms of American or young people's sentiment and support for, or I would say for Palestinians, but against really what they perceive as a genocide happening in Gaza. foreign policy decisions don't normally really influence voters. Do you think that's going to be different this year with Biden?
I think this is a foreign policy election.
You do?
I do.
Do you think it's the first of its? Well, I would
No,
say the post-9/11
we haven't
one.
had a foreign policy election since Vietnam. It used to be, World War II time, they were all foreign policy elections, right?
Yeah,
Then national
right.
security. But when I say foreign policy election, what I mean is if you take the constellation of immigration and border security, whether or not America is a democracy, and the Middle East, and put them together, those are all national security issues, broadly defined. I think those issues are at least as important to the American voters together as the economy. So in that regard, I think this does really matter. And I think that Biden, who you would have thought would be effectively running on foreign policy and national security, is actually not effectively running on foreign policy and national security. It is actually a vulnerability for him,
Right,
net, as of right now. But we're 5 months away. So my level of confidence on what's happening in November is like 0 at this
Right, well,
point.
because a lot can change before
A
then.
lot
But I'd
will
like,
change.
there's so many questions, but can you do you have a thought on that, or is there something that I haven't asked you? I know we haven't touched on climate. I mean, there's a whole range of issues we haven't.
Well, maybe we get them from them. I mean, my only thought is, I'll take the last point that Ian said. I have no idea what's going to happen tomorrow, let alone 5 months from now. When it comes to this, I do think that inflation, as we have seen and we talked about upstairs, has been extraordinarily important in elections
and
in
that's another
Europe
thing.
and the big ones. I think that will still be the issue. I mean, the way I summarize this election is very simple. If it's a referendum on Biden, Biden loses. If it's a choice, who knows? And I think that's the fundamentals. And the question is, what is going to be the part of the choice? Is it going to be foreign policy, economic policy, or what have you? Too early to tell. A lot of things going to happen. There may even be peace or a ceasefire in the Middle East by that time.
very
Who knows?
optimistic.
Let's hope so.
Kevin, do you have any thoughts to add?
No, I'm maintaining absolute ambassadorial neutrality on American domestic
I
politics.
knew you were going to say that.
Whoever the American people choose to be their next government, we in the Commonwealth of Australia will work with that government.
All right, let's go to Q&A. If you could introduce yourself and ask your question and make sure it's a question, would appreciate it. Please.
Hello, everyone. My name is Cameron So. Thanks for the panel. My question is about climate and tech policy.
Thank you.
We've had a record-breaking tornado month in May, and looks like it's going to be a big hurricane season.
Right.
And I see the challenge of passing tech policy and climate policy. I'm wondering if y'all think there's an ability at the state and local level to address some of these concerns, or like what institutions are we imagining we should create?
Great question.
My response to that, I've been engaged in international climate negotiations for a large slice of my public political career and have led multiple delegations to the relevant international conferences. Bottom line is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change has provided a sufficient international legal framework for states to act if they choose to act. And it has also created a sufficiently robust framework for who needs to do what and to what extent in terms of reducing the global greenhouse gas footprint in order for it to make a global effect, in order to keep global temperature increases within 1.5 degrees centigrade by the end of this century, which the international scientists conclude is the threshold point at which we start to produce irreversible climate change and irreversible change to ecosystems on the planet. So the framework is there. What is permanently the challenge is fragmented political and corporate will across most of the world, and not just the democratic world. If I look also at India, and if I look at China, the fact is, across all of these major emitters, we need to see further national action and corporate action. What is happening that's positive? You've pointed to it in your questions, sir, which is that subnational governments around the world, including here in the United States, state of California, other states, including here in Illinois. I was talking to Governor Pritzker about this the other day. The bottom line is that these states are putting in place subnational arrangements and making it possible for clean energy firms to invest and having them connected sufficiently to the grid to make a difference over time. That's a global phenomenon. And it's being driven partly by subnational governments, partly by the international agreement, partly by national laws, but also principally because private corporations and technologists have worked out there's a buck to be made out of this. And so therefore, if you look at the take-up now for renewable energies across the planet from where they were 20 years ago, absent any of these legal arrangements, to where they are now, you see a significant shift. It's still about 1/3 the speed that it needs to be, but if it's not stuck, it's simply not moving as rapidly as it needs.
Tiny bit of good news in this conversation. If you could keep your responses shorter, we could get through all the questions.
That goes.
No offense,
That's mainly
Kevin.
for Ian.
I'll try to make this
Yeah.
short.
Hi.
Charlotte Dennison, thank you so much for being here. My question specifically is for Ian. You mentioned earlier on that that one of the reasons you see World War III on the horizon, potentially, is because of failure of the West to integrate Russia. Do you think are you inferring that there was no attempt made by the West to integrate Russia?
Oh, no.
Thank you.
No, I don't think it was. I mean, as I said, when I made the point, I said we can debate why it didn't happen. There are some that believe that the United States should have made much more significant efforts with the NATO-Russia Council. There are some that believe that the EU should have made much more efforts with the European Union integration. There are some that believe that the Russians were incapable and kleptocratic and, would have had to have a very different system of governance. My point is that the reality that integration did not occur has gotten us to the situation that we are presently in. And that if there had been an integration, remember, think about Turkey. And Turkey doesn't have nukes, and we're all very happy for that. But I mean, one of the worst things you can do is you have a club, which is a cool club, and you don't say, no, you're not allowed to join. You say, we might be interested in having you join. And if you just jump through these hoops, we'll give you candidate member status, and then eventually we'll let you in. Nothing will piss a country off more than pretending you'll let them in and then saying, nah, you're just too Muslim, you're too big, we're not going to let you in. And I think that has honestly influenced the way Turks feel about the West, and certainly the way Erdogan. We're in a worse situation with Turkey as a member of NATO and not a member of the EU than if they had been integrated or if no one had ever tried. I think that Russia, there were mistakes like that were made, but that is a much longer debate.
Please.
Thank you for your brilliant presentation, the whole panel. My question is, my name is Art Franczek, by the way. I think it can be argued that the West response to the authoritarian regimes has been largely sanctions. In Russia, which the other month had a growth of about 3% according to the IMF, China has got all sorts of entity companies on the entity list like Huawei and others. And my question is, do you believe these sanctions are being effective? And if not, is there a better way, a more effective way of dealing with these authoritarian regimes? Thank you.
Ivo, do you want to take that?
So sanctions in and of itself are never going to be the way to change behavior in countries. It's rare for sanctions to actually work. One of the examples where it did is sanctions on Serbia during the dissolution of Yugoslavia, and sanctions did mobilize the domestic population that then, in the end, overthrew Milosevic. Although, looking at what Serbia is today, you can ask the question how effective that was in some ways. But sanctions are an important tool, and they're an important part of it. And so it's true that the Russian economy is growing 3% a year, but it's growing in the most unproductive way you can possibly grow an economy. It's a war economy. It is true that building tanks grows your gross domestic product, but if those tanks 3 days later are destroyed on the battlefield, what is that doing for the economic well-being of the society writ large? And so you have to not only look at what kind of growth is occurring, but how not just the amount of growth, but what kind of growth is occurring. And I think Kevin can talk a lot more about the Chinese economy, but there are significant problems in the Chinese economy that are both internal and in some ways are aggravated by the reality that countries are now starting to collaborate, particularly Western countries, on squeezing certain sectors of the Chinese economy, particularly in the high-tech side. And that is having an impact on China's ability to do what it wants to do. Now, is that enough? No. You need other parts of the equation, and just talking about the Ukraine and Russia. It does matter whether Ukraine gets military aid or not from the West in its impact on Russia and its ability to achieve what it wants to achieve. Without military aid, as we saw in the first 6 months and the last 6 months prior to the Congress's final approval of the aid package, things are pretty bad for the Ukrainians, or put it another way, they're pretty good for the Russians. With military aid, you will change that perspective. So it's not just one thing, it is sanctions, and it's an integrated strategy. We don't frankly have any strategy right now for dealing with the hybrid warfare that we talked about. Mm-hmm. What are we doing about it? Nothing, other than maybe some sanction here and there. So we need a more integrated strategy, but it'd be wrong to say that sanctions and economic measures shouldn't be part of that toolbox.
If I could quickly take the next two, and then I'm going to ask each panelist to address those questions and wrap it up, since we only have a couple minutes. If you can make your question quick, I'd appreciate it.
Robert Bornholtz, since the normative war is already underway, should American political leaders, both in civil society and government, push back against Xi Jinping's increasing pressure to take control of Taiwan, and especially raise the point that as long as the CCP system is so monstrous, the Taiwanese are perfectly right to want to have independence. But more concretely, should the United States join the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the new Trans-Pacific Partnership, and try to get Taiwan into that international organization as well?
Yes, thank you for bringing Taiwan into the conversation. And the last question, please.
Good morning, gentlemen. My name's Neville Gallen. We're discussing controlling or managing China and Russia. My question is, as they form BRICS and as BRICS has continued to grow and now they're starting to move towards destabilizing the dollar, what is the long-term effect on the U.S.? I can't see the U.S. sitting by quietly if they do reach their goal of trying to destabilize the dollar.
I'm going to start with Ian because he's going to model for everybody else how to respond in a minute or less.
Oh, I see.
And conclude.
Nice. Nice.
And because we're at 11 already.
So, okay. Look, I mean, I think that, I love the idea of the U.S. joining the TPP, and ponies for everyone here. Absolutely. Everyone gets a pony. It's not going to happen. And there are a lot of questions here about challenges that we'd love to see done that are politically impossible. But I want to close on an upbeat note, which is that the reason that we don't have a Cold War is because most countries around the world don't want to fight it, want no part of it, want to hedge. We haven't mentioned India once.
Yeah.
They've had an election, they have 15 years of more or less consistent governance, and they do not want any part of a fight between the United States and China. That means the BRICS isn't becoming an anti-G7 bloc. It's becoming a very complex group of countries that increasingly have importance that want to do business everywhere, some of which are problematic and some of which are less so. That's what we see around the world, in Latin America, in Africa, in Southeast Asia, even with American allies in Europe. We're going to see more of that. It's going to be fragmented, it's going to be messy, but if we end up in a much larger war, I don't think it's because we're going to see superpowers, breaking the world in two. It's going to be about mistakes, badly mismanaged crises that escalate out of control that aren't about individual leaders that are facing each other. I think it's going to be broader than that.
Ivo.
So I'm doesn't sound like it, but I'm an optimist.
They all brought it into the last question. Yeah.
Which is, I actually think that the United States has advantages over any other country in the world if we manage it in the right way. And the biggest advantage that we have is we have friends and allies around the world. And as long as we are able to work together with our friends in Asia, in Europe, in Africa, in Latin America, to focus on the fundamental principles of what makes for a stable and a just world order, which means we have to adjust quite a bit in how we behave. But if we do that in the right way, we can marshal resources, whether it is on regulating technology or countering malign influence of Russia and China and other countries, and do so in a way that enhances the security, prosperity, and freedom of more and more people. The big if is whether the United States will make the right choices for us to continue a practice that for 80 years, through bad mistakes, and we've made some really bad ones, Vietnam, Iraq, and others, but in the end come out and do the right thing. That, it seems to me, is both the hope for optimism and worry about the future.
Ambassador Rudd, how do you view us from from not a U.S. perspective, but
In negative 2 minutes.
yeah, in negative 2 minutes, exactly.
Good. I fall into the ranks of the pragmatic optimists, which is there are a bunch of stuff that the democratic world can do, which they are doing some, and frankly, collectively, they have a better set of cards to play than those who stand arrayed against the democratic world. On the specific question raised by our friend from the audience on US-China over Taiwan, the essential machinery of maintaining strategic stability is that of deterrence. The administration calls it integrated deterrence. The reason why, for example, the Chinese system up until now has decided against using unilateral military force to take over Taiwan is because deterrence is still working. And we need to be very clear about that. And deterrence is a dynamic equation. It's not static. It requires continued investment by the United States, by its allies, and by the Taiwanese themselves. The other reason to be, on balance, pragmatically optimistic is that we have an opportunity to develop further what we describe as strategic guardrails between China and the United States. So we've seen the reopening of military-to-military dialogue between the two sides since the meeting between the two presidents last November. We now see that unfolding between the various theatre commanders on both sides. Why is that important? Deterrence is about reducing the risk of war by design. Strategic guardrails are about reducing the risk of war by accident. Now, both those things, as of now, are working relatively well. But to conclude, and my word of caution at the end, is the Chinese strategy towards Taiwan at present is increasingly operating in various forms of hybrid and what is called the grey zone. And therefore, the challenge for the democratic world is how do you apply the principles of deterrence against, shall we say, scenarios short of war, short of invasion, but which aim to achieve the pressures necessary to bring about that level of political change in terms of Taiwan accepting, from Beijing's perspective, that it needs to be part of a unitary Chinese state. That is now the unfolding challenge for all of us.
Thank you. Please join me in thanking our panelists for a great conversation.